Do you think people that are following vegan diets then are going to be challenged to have really good gut health?
Yeah, in fact, I have looked at the microbiome profile of vegans and vegetarians, and
when it comes to our health, gut microbes are the new rock and roll. They say that if we take care of them, they'll take care of us. Which sounds great, but most of us don't really know how to do that. Dr. Rebecca Mahony does, and on this episode of Food Matters, she tells us how. Hi, I'm Mick Kelly, the founder of GIY, and you're very welcome to Food Matters, the podcast series where we meet the people who are reconnecting us with real, healthy, sustainable food. They tell us why food matters to them and why it should matter to you too. This episode is all about giving you a good gut feeling. We've all grown up learning that bugs and bacteria are bad, but a recent wave of science has proven that when it comes to the gut, they can actually be really, really good. Gut health expert Dr. Rebecca O'Mahony wants to help us all understand what our microbiome is and what we can do to make it happier and healthier. And we get into all of that and more in this episode.
to think of a human being as made up of cells. In actual fact, we have more microbial cells in us and on us than we do of human cells. So they must be doing something, and they are. I look at food in a very different way. I always think of, why am I eating this food? I'm eating this food because I know I'm going to feed my microbes. And so I'm feeding them, I'm not feeding me. They probably have more of a kind of a prebiotic effect. We know if we look at some of the kefirs and the fermented foods, pickles, fermented pickles,
beer,
and things like that.
Fermented.
Yeah. Maybe.
Am I stretching it a bit with that one?
So what makes somebody dedicate their life to exploring the world of bacteria, bugs and viruses and understanding the impact of the microbiome on human health? Well, I started our interview by asking Rebecca that very question.
Oh gosh, I was thinking about that when I came out here this morning, saying, okay,
How did I end up here?
How did I end up here? Well, I guess when I suppose I'm bringing it, casting it back to my childhood, like my mother would have grown her own fruit and veg when I was a young girl. So she would have had a quarter of an acre or whatever. Nice. And so she would have literally, like what you're doing here, grow your own. She literally grew her vegetables, her fruit, her rhubarbs, her potatoes, carrots and so on. So I guess I was exposed to that at a young age. And, I was helping her plant and harvest and all those things. So I always probably, it was around me as a young girl. And so I always kind of valued the importance of food and where your food comes from, I think. And then I suppose in terms of, I moved into kind of education and did my degree and so on and spent, I suppose, my undergraduate and postgraduate education would have been very much around microbiology and molecular biology. So really that's kind of understanding how microbes work, understanding how they grow, when they grow, how to switch on their genes, how to switch off their genes. So that was very much my kind of, I suppose, my academic life from my 20s to 30s, I guess. So I spent a lot of time understanding the behavior of microbes. So it, but very much academic, very much an academic kind of positioning. And it wasn't until I think must have been about 5 years ago, I was at a local art class here, local, and a couple of the people in the art class, just said, Rebecca, do you know anything about probiotics and which one should I take? And they were asking just, simple questions like that as to, they didn't know which ones to take. They didn't understand what their microbiomes actually meant. So it really came out of kind of those informal conversations that I realized, okay, people need to understand this, and so that's where it has grown from. So people started asking me for help and advice on what is the gut microbiome and what probiotics should I take, or should I take an antibiotic or not, or so that's really where it kind of came from.
So at a basic level, presumably I can go to your company and get my microbiome analysed, tell me what's going on, what's good, what's not good, and come with recommendations. Is that effectively the service that you're talking about?
Yeah, exactly. That's it. Yeah, and it's non-invasive. So that's the other thing. That it's a simple kind of non-invasive procedure. Yeah. So really, what happens is I would just do a quick conversation around your general health and lifestyle, and we analyse the gut microbiome profile. I look at all the bacterial species and microbes within the gut, and then I explain it back to you, the client, as to the kind of the state of the current microbiome profile, and then I can recommend. And in some cases, individuals' profiles might be rather good, and they might be quite relieved that they think there's something wrong, but in actual fact they don't. And I think that's equally important to say as well. This isn't about doing microbiome profiling to diagnose an illness. It's very much about.
Sometimes it can be that, I guess.
Well, there are some bacteria that are showing promise, I suppose, in terms of being potential putative early biomarkers in relation to early onset of certain colorectal cancers, and also with Alzheimer's and some of the neurodegenerative diseases. So there are some organisms out there that are potential biomarkers, and maybe the future of medicine might go this way. So it's just generally in terms of a client. So I can say what the condition of the gut looks like, and advise on dietary interventions. So if you're, for example, you have low levels of your mucin producer, well, then I could suggest to you need to eat X, Y, and Z to increase the levels of that organism in your gut.
How did you get from somebody asked you in an art class, and presumably you have lots of people all the time given your expertise, saying, well, what can I do for my gut health? But how did you get from there, feeling that there was a demand there, to actually kind of leaving the academic world and setting up your own company to help people?
Oh gosh, yeah, there's probably two parts to that answer. I think one is if I'm to cast my mind back to when I postdoced in UCD, I was awarded a Newman Scholarship. And I suppose the philosophy around the Newman Scholarship is about providing knowledge and education to people. So for me, academia is absolutely wonderful, and that and I have produced many peer-reviewed scientific publications. But I always felt that it was lost in some respects, because it was always, I suppose, scientists and academics can read those articles, but the normal person doesn't have that access. So for me, it's twofold. One, I really believe that education should be accessible to people. And I love when people genuinely understand something that they didn't know before. That's one aspect of it. So I suppose BiomiCare was born out of that desire, or passion, whichever it is. I realized, okay, people genuinely need to have this knowledge. And I have the knowledge, and I can translate it into something easy for someone to understand. I think that's probably the main reason for me, was to set up BiomiCare, alongside of going to the art class and people asking about what probiotics to take. I've had a couple of people come to me who genuinely have been quite ill, and were wanting to look at a new and different way of looking after their health. And I felt I had some of the knowledge, and I knew that I could help them by assessing their microbiome for them to be relieved, and also to for them to have an understanding of their own bodies. And I think that was important for in cases with a lot of my clients, that they have an understanding of their gut health.
Yeah.
And when they have understanding of their gut health, then I can actually put dietary interventions in place to support them going forward.
One thing I'm kind of really curious about, we were always sort of conditioned, I think, to think that bacteria is sort of bad. You know, you need to scrub them off your sink and you need to get them off your hands and stuff. But when it comes to our gut and our microbiome, they seem to be really good. So how do we know the sort of the difference between what's good and what's bad?
Yeah, in terms of, I suppose, microbes, we have this idea, as you said, that, you know, microbes are bad and, you know, they can cause disease. But in actual fact, we have a whole host of microbes in us and on us that are actually really, really important and really valuable. So we have quite a lot of good bacteria, as well as the bad bacteria. And sometimes the bad bacteria get a little bit of attention as a result of infection and disease. But in actual fact, when we look at the whole, I suppose, microbiome, it's not just gut microbiome. There's scalp microbiome, skin microbiome, gut microbiome. It's a whole, you know, array of different microbiomes.
What does microbiome mean? Because like I've heard the phrase or the word a lot. Like what is it actually referring to, your microbiome?
Yeah, so it's referring to all of the microorganisms in your body. So you have bacteria, for example, is one type of microorganism. You have fungi, another type of microorganism. You have another funny word called archaea. They're another type of microbe. We have phages, which are basically viruses that infect bacteria. And we also then have viruses themselves. And so, you know, again, I suppose, viruses, we tend to think they're all bad. They're not all bad. Phages are good for us. Viruses we have helpful viruses, we have helpful bacteria, we have helpful fungi. So collectively, there's a whole array of these tiny microorganisms that all come together and produce what we call the microbiome.
And so, like, are we born with these, or do they kind of come into our body over time? And like, can we put a kind of weight on this? Like, you know, you think about your heart weighs whatever number of grams. What quantity of these are we carrying around with us day to day?
Oh, quite a lot. In fact, we have more microbes in us and on us than we do of actual cells. So if we were to think of a human being as made up of cells and all different types of cells, but in actual fact, we have more microbial cells in us and on us than we do of human cells. So that's fairly significant. So they must be doing something, and they are.
And are we born with them?
Yes. So you will get a microbiome profile from your parents, and particularly from the maternal side. So there is a kind of a vertical transmission of a kind of what we would say, or what I to simplify it, like a blueprint microbiome, in the same way that you'll have DNA transferred from genetic inheritance of DNA. But it's not the only microbiome. So you will acquire microbiome during, you know, as a result of what you're exposed to in your environment, for example. And equally, you know, your microbiome shifts and changes as you age. So, for example, the type of microbiome that you will have as an infant is going to be quite different to the type of microbiome that you will have as a teenager, for example, or as a young adult. And equally, then that'll shift and change as you age. So when you go into your 40s, 50s, or even when you go into your 70s and 80s. So the microbiome shifts and moves all of the time. It's not a stagnant thing. So it's the interplay between your diet, your exercise, what you eat, the external environment, but also then your internal microbiome. So it's constantly moving and shifting.
Yeah. So that's interesting the way you put that, because I was just going to say, is it fair to represent it as like, you have a foundation you're born with, and then it's the external factors, your environment, your diet. I'm interested you said exercise, like, because that doesn't make sense to me. How does exercise affect your collection of bacteria and viruses and those other elements you talk about?
Yeah, well, actually, there's been several studies done on looking at the effect of exercise on your microbiome. There are particular, and it's not as straightforward as one organism contributes to a particular health and wellness or disease. But when there's some studies done, when you look at microbiome, for example, and individuals who are interested in, say, for example, resistance training, that certain bacteria are elevated at higher levels as a response of, for example, resistance training. So it's quite interesting to see that the microbiome changes as a result of response to exercise, but also individuals that may have particular collection of microbes or bacteria in their gut perform better because they have those microbes.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's think about then how damaged is the modern gut microbiome, or is that the wrong way to think about it? We have this sense that, you know, all of us are going around with sort of depleted microbiome, and it's certainly like a hugely kind of hot topic, I suppose. But are we able to sort of assess that, like assess how damaged our microbiomes are, or is it more that this is such a modern science that we don't have anything to compare it with?
Well, I suppose to give you context, initially, in the last, I suppose, 20 years, we've moved enormously in terms of our capacity to analyze human beings and the microbiomes of human beings as a result of the advances in science. So we still are learning and are continuing to learn about the functionality and the importance of the microbiome. That's one thing. But just in terms of, yes, the idea of whether we have a kind of a damaged gut, just from looking at all of the research and hundreds of peer-reviewed publications around microbiome, gut health, skin health, scalp microbiome, the whole lot, and the microbiome as a result of various diseases and so on. But really, if we're to kind of look at what does the healthy microbiome looks like, we can't really say definitively what a healthy microbiome looks like, but we can certainly see that in some individuals there may be a lack of certain organisms within the microbiome, and that these organisms, the lack of them, can contribute to certain diseases. So, for example, if individuals have kind of low levels of bifidobacterium, that can have an effect on the overall gut performance in relation to production of certain neurotransmitters. So if you have low levels of bifidobacterium, well, then you have lower levels of short-chain fatty acid production and lower levels of the likes of GABA and so on. Equally, individuals that might have very low levels of, for example, Akkermansia mucophilia, is just another organism that's found in the gut. And
a bacteria?
It's a bacteria. Okay. Yeah, it's anaerobic. It doesn't like oxygen. It lives in the intestines, and we've learned that Akkermansia, its job, as with all microbes in the gut, just to say, or in any microbiome, they're there to do jobs. That's the essential part of it, and that's why the microbiome is important, because all of these microbes actually are doing work. So Akkermansia mucophilia, its job is to produce mucin, and so mucin is a sticky-like substance, very similar to saliva in your mouth, for example. And our large intestine and our intestines need this saliva-like substance within the gut, and so Akkermansia, its job is to produce that mucin. So if you have depleted levels of Akkermansia, well, then you have depleted levels of mucin,
right,
or depleted levels of the saliva in the gut. And so when you have depleted levels of saliva in the gut, for example, what that does, it increases the opportunity of potential pathogens to adhere to the gut lining and then to get in and cause inflammation, infection, and so on. So I suppose to answer your question, we do need to monitor, what microbes are there, what levels they're at, which ones are at very low levels, and equally which ones are actually at very high levels. So, we know, for example, with other microbes or other bacteria, for example, biophilia, a bacterium, when biophilia is too high, it's as a result of a poor diet. So low fiber, high fat, and so biophilia increases above the levels that it probably should be at. And so then that can cause inflammation and therefore have a knock-on effect in relation to gut homeostasis.
Yeah. So like, I guess just from reading, articles and hearing things about this, you sort of have this sense that maybe all illness can be traced back to sort of gut health. People talk about the link with depression, the link with other illnesses. Like, would you, if you looked at a sample of someone's microbiome and in a very unhealthy person, would you sort of see those connections, do you think, between that? Is it too sort of sensationalist to say that gut health is the foundation for overall health?
I think we are understanding a lot more about the microbiome currently. I think there are very interesting kind of insights into the role of microbiome, and that certain bacteria in particular can and may in the future become what we call potential biomarkers for detection and onset of certain diseases. It is complex, I will say that. It is complex, and sometimes it's not just one bacterium. If it's elevated or at very low levels, is going to be attributed or the main contributing factor to a disease. There's the genetics, there's the epigenetics, and then there's microbiome. But there's so much work being done on it at the moment, and there is increasing evidence to show that when there are variations and shifts and changes in the microbiome profile, that is associated with certain kind of diseases or ailments. So, for example, I could list off a couple. There's plenty of them. So, when we look at mood, for example, so if we talk about mood, we know that Bacillus humiformis, Bacillus fragilis, and Bacillus cacaceae are all increased. They tend to go up in association. The levels rise up.
If your mood is low.
If your mood is low.
Okay.
And the reason for that is because these particular organisms, and sometimes it's not just three, I've just listed three there, but there may be others.
Three of millions.
Three of millions.
Okay.
But they seem to be elevated in individuals who have, for example, low mood.
Yeah.
And what we think is happening is that these organisms are depleting the serotonin that's actually in the gut. Wow. So it's like as if they're kind of gobbling up the serotonin. So then there's lower levels of serotonin.
Okay. And what has caused those increases then in those bacteria you're talking, or the bacillus you're talking about, or do we know?
I think it's as a result of having lower levels of bifidobacterium, lower levels of, and again, it's not one specific organism, but for example, fecal bacterium Prownitsky, we know actually has a really good anti-inflammatory effect within the gut.
It's like the interplay there is just so complex, isn't it? Like that's what's kind of dawning on me here in this conversation, because like so effectively you're saying because one bacteria is the levels are low, these sort of bad bacteria in inverted commas, the levels of them is higher. That's affecting your serotonin levels, which is affecting your mood. Like it's crazy how complex that is. Like
and I suppose, as I said, it's not just one particular bacterium. Like if I look at, if I just list, there's another example whereby if we look at there was a huge clinical review done. This is a systematic review on human clinical studies. Now, having said that, human clinical studies are they're few and far between. Most studies are actually murine studies. So there's, a lot of work has been done in mice to understand the role of gut microbiome. But if we look at the human clinical review and associated with kind of, if you were to take the example of mood or depressive disorders, we know that the bacteria dentes go down, the Prevodella go down, fecal bacterium go down, Coprococcus goes down, Sotorella goes down, Acinetobacter goes up, Egertella goes up, Firmicutes go down, Dialester goes down, and then the Enterobacteriaceae, the E. coli, the Shigella, they all come up.
Yeah.
So it's like as if there's always this balance. So you have to kind of keep the potential pathogens or pathogens, you have to keep them quiet. You have to turn down their noise levels, and you have to bring up the good bacteria. So when all those organisms go down, the ones I've just mentioned, it has been seen in reviews that any individuals that have, say, depressive disorders, for example, now having said that, some of it is genetic as well, so but we know that it affects what we call the gut-brain axis. So we know, for example, that certain bacteria within the gut that they actually affect and communicate with the brain, and we also know that some bacteria are responsible for producing 5-HT, which is the precursor to the full molecule serotonin. So there's a lot going on. Yeah.
Can I just ask you, because obviously one of the big problems we have as a society is overweight and obesity. Do we, like, given the obvious kind of connection between food and gut health, is there something sort of more interesting going on there around the interplay of that as a health issue and the microbiome, the gut microbiome?
Yeah, so again, it's obesity is complex. It is a complex disorder. You do have the genetics associated with it, you have the environment, and then you have the metabolism. We know that in particular with obesity, we know that if you have low consumption of probiotics, as in natural probiotics, the likes of your yogurts, your cheeses and all of those, that because then you have a reduced level of your bifidobacteriums that produce the GABA, that can have an interplay with obesity as well. We know that the organisms associated with obesity affect gut-brain integrity, so that's the kind of gut-brain barrier, like what I said to you earlier on with the saliva of the gut. That can be hampered, if you like, in individuals that actually are obese. That's probably one of the main ones, and I've seen that with some individuals, particularly in the US, for example, where access to good organic food is obviously more expensive, but it's not accessible to all. And so those individuals might have actually depleted levels of Akkermansia, for example, and that can have a knock-on effect. We know in relation to obesity that some bacteria that are responsible for producing what we call metabolites, so just to break that down in simple English, basically bacteria, their job is to produce products, okay? And it's the products of the bacteria in the gut that we actually need, and so we call that word metabolites. So sometimes, yes, the bacteria are important, but it's also what the bacteria produce are equally important. And we know in relation to obesity that if certain metabolites are not produced, well, then that affects what we call satiety. So your whole feeling full. The feeling full thing gets kicked out of sync, and then insulin resistance gets all unbalanced, so to speak. Also, what happens in relation to individuals that are obese or clinically obese or morbidly obese, depends on how you diagnose it, that how we actually metabolize bile acids gets all put out of sync as well. And that's as a result of the unbalance within the gut microbiome. So there are changes in bile acid production, changes in short chain fatty acid production. Not enough of them are being manufactured, for example. And then there's changes in which is a complex area, but all of this, what we call molecular signaling pathways, get all disrupted as a result. So the microbes, we need them. They are producing metabolites, and those metabolites are responsible for the likes of the satiety and insulin resistance.
What do you think when you look at this under the microscope, as it were? I mean, you've said several times there that the function of these organisms is to do something for us, like produce, but presumably that's not their reason for being. You know what I mean? Like they're there, just hanging out, living. You know, that just is a byproduct of what they're doing. But they're kind of, you know, what's your sense of that when you look at these organisms under a microscope? That is it all about the function that they have for us? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I guess. I suppose it's a relationship between all microbes.
Yeah.
That it's well, for example, if you take viruses, I mean, viruses need a host cell in order to replicate. So if you're to take viruses, for example, they heavily rely on a host cell in order for them to replicate. So the good viruses and the phages, for example, they have they have a direct relationship with us, because phages are viruses that specifically infect bacteria. So that's a very direct kind of interlinked relationship. And equally the same with viruses. And I suppose bacteria and fungi, it's a symbiotic relationship, really. It's probably as similar to, if you think of soil and microbes in the soil, and you think of microbes in the root of the plant, that's a complete symbiotic relationship. They both benefit from each other.
And our relationship with them is symbiotic as well, then, I guess.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you bring up the soil thing, because I'm always struck by that sort of similarity. We're talking a lot at the moment about the impact of chemical inputs in soil on the, you know, the organisms in the soil, and how that affects the plants and ultimately affects our own health and so on. I suppose the equivalent with our gut microbiome is the sort of the external things we're introducing into our bodies that maybe, you know, have a huge impact. So I'm thinking about things like ultra processed food. I'm thinking about antibiotics. I'm thinking about alcohol and so on. Like what does the evidence tell us about how impactful those external substances are on our gut and on the collection of organisms in our gut?
Yeah, so if we take antibiotics, first of all, I guess that's probably my area of expertise back in the day.
Right.
So in terms of antibiotic resistant bacteria.
And I mean, just to say, for most people's reality is several antibiotic courses a year. You know, like you get an infection or you get something and you go to the doctor. Most people, I think, want to hold off as long as they can, or some people just are like, go straight to the antibiotics, please. It is a reality for people. What does it do to our guts?
Yeah, you're right. It is a reality, and to be fair, there are times when you do need to take an antibiotic. So that's, you know, that has to happen. What can happen in terms of, I suppose, the effect of antibiotics on the gut is several things. You know, it can wipe out the commensal organisms within the gut. But if they're not taken correctly, or if a course isn't completed, for example, in some instances, some bacteria, particularly what we call the gram-negative bacteria, so in your microbiome, or in microbiology in general, we class them based on whether they're gram-positive or gram-negative bacterium. So what that means in English is they have thick cell wall is gram-positive, a thin cell wall is gram-negative. Okay. So we characterize them based on the thickness of their wall. Okay. Simple as that. So gram-negative bacteria have the capacity to acquire drug resistance really easily and fairly quickly as well. So, and they do that by several mechanisms. One mechanism is by they literally take on the antibiotic resistant genes. They actually swap the genes, or they exchange DNA. They exchange genes, which is can be done really quickly. So, so the bacteria then become drug resistant. So then you're dealing with an issue where the bacteria in the gut, so the likes of your E. coli, your salmonellas, they're gram negatives, that they can become what we call multi-drug resistant rather quickly. If you're continually
are the gram negative ones usually the bad ones, like, or is that too simplified?
Well, I suppose some of the pathogens that we would be familiar with, so the likes of your E. coli and salmonellas, they're gram negative, and they can become multi-drug resistant. So it does have an effect on the microbes in your gut. Taking continual antibiotics over a period of time.
I've heard it said like it takes your gut a month or so to recover, and it does come back to a base level. Like, is it fair to characterize it as like it's like a nuclear bomb, blitzes the bacteria in your gut, or is that too strong to say that?
It depends on what antibiotic, first of all. But so it'll kill the bacteria that it needs to kill, for example. But bacteria they reseed and grow rather quickly, so you can replenish your gut microbiome.
If it was at 100%, say, before you took the antibiotics, your bacteria in your gut, what percent is it going to be after a week of antibiotics?
Oh. Gosh, I don't really know, but in terms of, I know that it'll affect the gut microbiome, but you can replenish it fairly quickly by putting in the likes of your probiotics or eating foods that are going to encourage the likes of your gram-positive bifidobacteriums and so on.
Actually, I've always wondered, like, should you take, because they, doctors and pharmacists will say that you should take a probiotic. Should you take it while you're taking the antibiotics or afterwards?
After. After would be better.
Because presumably during it's going to kill the probiotic bacteria as well, is it?
Well, probiotics by nature, they are a lot of the probiotics that are on the market, they would be spore forming bacteria, so they naturally will get through the stomach and into the intestines, and that's why we use spore producing bacterium as probiotic cultures there. But so to go back to your question about ultra processed foods, like we know, for example, certain emulsifiers actually do affect the gut microbiome. There was a couple of studies done. Again, now these are murine studies, so just to say that. But in terms of, there was one particular study done, it was a large study done on looking at the effect of emulsifiers on the gut microbiome of mice. And so what those studies did is they fed the mice basically emulsifiers and look at the microbiome profile as a result.
Poor old mice.
And the poor old mice. So the emulsifier treated microbiome was put into germ-free mice, and then the results after that were analysed. And what that showed was that levels of Proteobacter, which are the likes of the E. coli and salmonellas, the ones that we don't really want, the levels of those rose there. And what that meant in terms of the levels of proteobacteria going up, what that meant in terms of a kind of physical change within the gut of the animal was that the gut mucosa, the lining, the saliva that I spoke about earlier, that reduced significantly. So you have lack of the nice saliva in the gut, increase in inflammation, and then there was issues with glycemic control that actually happened as well. Decreases in bifidobacterium. Control
being how you deal with
your sugars. How your body regulates sugar.
Presumably that becomes a potential issue with diabetes and so on.
Exactly. Now so you have the decrease in bifidobacteriums as a result. That's what happened in that study. And then you decrease in the bacteria that have the ability to carry out what we call fermentation processes. And then in that case, they looked at there was a reduction of short chain fatty acid producing bacterium as well. Now just to say, like, there are just some some studies, but we can see that there seems to be an effect when you actually consume a diet which is ultra processed.
And I mean, there's loads of evidence to show that a diet like ultra processed food diets increase levels of all sorts of diet related illness, and this perhaps suggests why, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yes, we're trying to figure out what is the impact of consuming ultra processed foods, what impact that's actually having on the gut microbiome.
I've a friend of mine who we've actually had on this podcast before, Dr. Steve Collins, and he talked about the sort of dangers of emulsifiers, and it really kind of stuck in my head, as like he sort of was suggesting it's a very practical tip that actually, avoid them and it's going to really help your overall health. And when you start kind of looking for it, like emulsifiers are in everything, from like chewing gum, biscuits, they're so endemic across the types of food we eat now, unfortunately. Like, it really comes back to like a whole food diet is almost the only way to avoid them. They're so prevalent.
I agree. I suppose in terms of, in Ireland, we're very lucky, I guess, in that we have, access to good food and food that isn't ultra processed. Although I suppose we are seeing in supermarkets are changing, but overall, I think we are lucky in Ireland where we do have access to whole good foods. You have access to organic food much easier than, say, for example, in other countries. So I think
we have access to it.
I
think a lot of the evidence suggests we're probably preferring more processed foods increasingly. But one of the things you just said there is interesting. Like, do we know the impact of the chemicals that are used in our food system? So I'm thinking like pesticides, fertilizers, the sort of herbicides like glyphosates and so on. Do we know, is there any research to speak to the impact of that on our gut health if we're consuming, fruits and vegetables that are sprayed with those kind of chemicals?
Well, bacteria the microorganisms in general are fairly sensitive to what you actually feed them. So in terms, just I suppose a general comment on that is that yes, they're definitely going to be impacted because if you were to do even a simple laboratory experiment and put some bacteria in a tube of broth and you feed it varying concentrations of glucose, for example, or varying concentrations of a protein source, it's going to change its behavior. So certainly they are going to be impacted by whatever chemicals that are presented there.
Even in small quantities, like, which I guess if you're eating, I don't know, a leek that has been sprayed with, the field has been sprayed with glyphosate where it was grown, it still has the potential to come in small quantities and have an impact.
Yeah. Now, some bacteria have the capacity within them and within their genetics to break down toxic chemicals and so on. So, I mean, that's something that bacteria naturally can do anyway. But in terms of dealing with chemicals, they're going to respond to that.
What about? I almost hate to bring this up because I do like a glass of wine. It must be said. Like, what is the impact of alcohol on our microbiome? And I suppose, is there a sort of a safe level? Is it about moderation, or is all alcohol bad for our gut health?
I guess if we were to look at, I suppose, alcohol consumption, if you look at, I suppose there's roughly 3 million deaths according to the World Health Organization related to excessive alcohol consumption. Ethanol itself is actually naturally absorbed within the GI tract by microbes, and it's done by a simple kind of diffusion mechanism, so that's fine. A little bit of alcohol is fine. It's when you're dealing with kind of chronic heavy alcohol consumption, it does have an effect on the gut microbiome and the the populations start moving and shifting and changing. So, for example, what happens is Roseborrhea drops down, fecal bacterium, the one that we really like, which has really good positive anti-inflammatory effect, reduces. Blautia goes down, Akkermansia, the mucin, the saliva producer, goes down. Your lactobacilli, your bifidobacteriums, they're all the short chain fatty acid producing organisms. They all start dropping down.
Okay.
And as a result of, and we'd look at excessive alcohol consumption, the bacteria associated with what we call the Proteobacteria phylum, so that's all your E. coli's, your Shigellas, your Klebsiellas, your Enterobacters, your Proteus, your Serratias, they all start going up. Okay. And you don't want them going up, basically. Right. You want to keep them at bay. So it does have an effect. And in terms of the products that are not being produced within the gut, the short chain fatty acids are not being produced, or they will be produced at limited quantities. So what that means, that then you have a reduction in your, it's like a manufacturing plant. If you can imagine, you think of an industry is producing a product. So if you don't have the raw materials, you're not going to get X amount of batch of products at the end of a working week, for example. Yeah. So the same is true within the microbiome. So if you don't have the correct good bacteria there at the correct levels, they can't produce the product, in which case, in this case, with high alcohol consumption, you're not getting enough short chain fatty acids being produced at the end of the week, basically.
So just can you speak to, like, for those of us that enjoy a glass of wine, right? And not that this is like a personal consultation for me, but what like is there habits around, like, so obviously you want to try and stick within the the guidelines for what is safe alcohol consumption and not excessive, but like are there sort of habits around alcohol consumption that are better than others? So I'm thinking, is a glass of wine with your dinner every night bad or good? Is it better to sort of have no alcohol for 3 or 4 days or 5 days and have a glass of wine at the weekend? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there a habit that has an impact there as well as the levels of consumption?
It's I suppose to answer that, it's probably a little bit. It doesn't and not to, I suppose, go into a whole kind of binge consumption. Okay. Yeah, because that is going to affect the gut microbiome. So if it is within the recommended limits of red wine per week, you're probably okay. You're probably fine. Yeah, absolutely.
Is excessive alcohol consumption on a par with antibiotics as in terms of damage?
Well, with excessive alcohol consumption, it's different. It's going to affect what we call, it's going to increase what we call pro-inflammatory markers, and it increases these molecules called Toll receptor proteins. So basically they're proteins that literally turn on a pro-inflammatory response. So the whole point is to keep everything, if you can imagine your gut, you want to color code it. Red is inflammation and green is nice and healthy homeostasis. So what you want to do is you want to keep it within the green all the time, I guess. So excessive alcohol consumption causes an increase in these pro-inflammatory markers, and then you get an increase in inflammation.
A quick one. Now, I know you get asked on almost every podcast these days to hit that follow or subscribe button, but they never really tell you why that's important. Simply put, if you hit the follow button, it helps us to grow the show, get more great guests, and to reach more people just like you. So it's a small gesture from you that means a huge amount to us. Thanks. Now back to the episode.
What about fiber, Rebecca? It's like I've listened to a couple of things that says that it's almost one of the biggest problems that we don't talk about enough, that we don't have enough fiber in our diet. What role does that take, and what are the practical things that we can do to bring more fiber into our diet?
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head. Yeah, we don't consume enough fiber at all, and I suppose 30 or 40 years ago we probably consumed more of it because we didn't have access to processed foods. So we would have consumed more root vegetables, for example, going back to the traditional type of diet here in Ireland.
We tend to think about fibre as just helping move things along down there, but they play a role in feeding these the microbiome organisms as well.
Yes. Oh, absolutely.
Is that why it helps move things along?
Yes. Yeah. It's a combination of both. So if you look
without getting too icky, you mentioned several times bacteria that produce mucus. Is that like helping things move along?
Well, the mucus in terms of within the intestinal cell wall is to prevent, I suppose, pathogens attaching and evading and causing inflammation. Okay. But in terms of fibre, what will happen is you'll have bacteria that are really good. So one particular one, Celluliticus, it is a key player in digesting complex carbohydrates. And so when you consume complex carbohydrates, for example, your fibre and your roughage, Celluliticus then increases in abundance levels. And so what that does, it has what we call an anti-inflammatory effect on the gut and the body overall. So consuming more fibre is actually important.
How can we do that? Like, what are the quick ways to bring more fibre into your diet?
Yeah, so simple things like consuming your root vegetables, your carrots, your parsnips, your turnips, all of those things. Consuming your bran, consuming your wheat if you can. Consuming your potatoes with the skin on, like the kind of old-fashioned methods that we would have done long ago, but we seem to have lost some of those practices.
Beans and pulses as well, I guess.
Beans, pulses, grains, all those,
Okay, so that's fibre. Then I'm a bit confused about the whole prebiotic, probiotic. Like, what are they doing different what do each of them do for the microbiome then? Okay,
so a probiotic basically is a live bacterium or culture that you're going to ingest.
So that's in your yogurt, and
that's in your yogurt. It's in your kind of your yogurt drinks and your yogurts, and also you can buy your commercial probiotics as well. And there's hundreds of different types on the market. Some of them have different types of bifidobacterium and different strain types, so there's a whole plethora of them. So
I've heard Tim Spector, for example, being very negative about shop purchased probiotic drinks and things, and like we're I think we like simple fixes, so the idea that you can have a shot every morning of a drink to do that, but his point would be a natural whole food like a yogurt is probably as good, if not better. Would you agree with that?
I would, because when you look at probiotics, I think there are a couple of things. You need to know what bacteria are in the probiotic, so the quick probiotic drink that you're talking about. You need to, I suppose, they have to be at a certain quantity in order for them to be effective. Yeah. So you have to probably be up at 10 to the 12 CFUs per mil. So that's what we call colony forming units per mil, in order for it to pass through the stomach and get into the gut. And then the organism has to be viable when it actually gets to the gut. So there's a lot of things to consider when producing a probiotic. But there are probiotics out in the market that do meet those criteria. But if you're to bring it back to how can you do it in a more holistic, organic way, is by consuming the likes of your fresh yogurts, consuming your fermented foods, consuming your kefir. So what that's going to do, it's going to actually, basically what you're doing is you're kind of seeding your gut. You're seeding it, and then they'll actually grow in plentiful supply within the gut then.
But presumably, Rebecca, it's important to which yogurt, because you could have like an organic natural yogurt, or you could have like a yogurt that's loaded with sugar and emulsifiers and all sorts, which comes with all the other stuff that you've already spoken about as being not so good. And that comes back to education and knowledge, and knowing which yogurt to choose based on what's on the label. Okay. So talk to me about prebiotics then. What are they, and what's the difference?
Yeah. So a prebiotic basically is like a complex polysaccharide that when you consume a prebiotic, what that does, it encourages the growth of the probiotic or the bacteria that are in the gut already.
Okay.
So in simple terms, in English, that's like putting a scaffolding in the gut for it to stick onto.
Okay.
Or it's a bit like, creating a web within the gut. And if you create a web, then the bacteria can literally latch onto it and grow. Or equally, as I was explaining to someone else recently, it's a bit like, if you want to paint the outside of your house, the easiest way to do that is put up scaffolding around the outside of your house, so you can actually access the wall to paint it. So the scaffolding is the prebiotics, like the scaffolding. So you're putting the scaffolding into the gut, and then the bacteria can stick onto the scaffolding, and then they can grow in plentiful supply.
Okay. So what are examples of prebiotic foods then?
So any foods that have what we call a fructooligosaccharides, so FOS, galactooligosaccharides.
There must be an acronym you can use.
FOS and GOS. So they would be the kind of scientific names. But prebiotics, so things like your pulses, your grains, your celeries, your asparagus, all of those type of roughage type of foods, your root vegetables, your tubers,
plants, effectively.
Plants, yeah.
So any particular types of plants? So you've mentioned pulses and beans, you've mentioned some brassicas, or does it matter? Is it all? I think starchy root crops, for example, be prebiotic.
Yeah, starchy root crops. That's exactly it.
Okay, so basically loads of plants.
Yeah.
Okay, and then. So what about like fermented foods? Because obviously they're having a bit of a hipster moment in the sun. We sell a lot of kombucha downstairs here in Grow HQ, and I've started making it at home. Like that whole sort of category, I suppose, things people can do at home, like kefir and kombucha, sauerkrauts and things like that, kimchis. Like are they prebiotic as well, or are they doing something totally different? The fact that they're fermented, I guess, you're bringing good bacteria into your system. Is that the idea there?
Yeah, it's probably a combination of both. They probably have more of a kind of a prebiotic effect in some ways, because we know if we look at some of the kefirs and the fermented foods, or even things like pickles. So if we're to look at kind of fermented pickles,
beer
and things like that.
Fermented?
Yeah. Maybe.
Am I stretching it a bit with that one?
Yeah. We know that if you consume the likes of those fermented foods, that fecal bacterium Prownitsky in particular, and there's different phyllotypes of fecal bacterium Prownitsky, that the levels of fecal bacterium Prownitsky increase. And we know that fecal bacterium Prownitsky has a really positive anti-inflammatory effect on the gut. So in other words, basically keeping the gut nice and green and healthy and homeostatic and happy. So that's really what we're doing by consuming the likes of fermented foods and kefir, that you are encouraging good bacteria to literally override and keep the not so good bacteria at bay.
Can you go too far with that, like having too much of that in your diet, or no? Is it all?
I think it's about portion size, and you're not going to guzzle down a whole liter of kefir in one day, because you will certainly notice the difference if you guzzle down a liter of kefir. So it's simple and often, it's you have to.
So small amounts regularly.
Yeah.
Okay. Just one other thing I wanted to ask then about. Like time restricted eating is a huge kind of, again, hot topic. People kind of intermittent fasting and so on. Is there any science around the impact of that on your gut health? If you're not eating from say 7-8 o'clock at night until 11 o'clock the next day, is that a good or a bad thing for your gut, do you think?
Yeah, there's been a couple of studies done on that. So if we were to look at kind of intermittent fasting, for example, which is one way to look at it, we know that if you have kind of intermittent fasting, it can improve, I suppose, what we call longevity. So it's good as we age, and it improves the aging process. And so it improves kind of metabolic regulation. It improves kind of hormonal control. It improves kind of blood glucose levels as well. It improves lipid metabolism, and it also keeps the inflammatory responses kind of at bay. So it can have an actual positive effect to do intermittent fasting. In terms of, I suppose, when we talk about food and when we eat food, and the timing of when we eat food is important, because there is a whole interplay with what we call our circadian rhythm. So when we sleep and when we eat. So there's work done on that.
Yeah.
Some of the work is.
Does that suggest like you should have a gap between your last?
Yes.
Not just your last meal, but your last intake of any food.
Yes.
And going to sleep. So like not eating after.
Yeah.
Whatever, depending on what time you go to bed, I guess.
Yeah, because the body has to go through its kind of cellular repair, and there is some work done and studies that look at the importance of having a little break from consuming food. Is because, well, one thing, the human body, the cells of the human body have to go through cellular repair anyway, and which they do every single day anyway. Yeah. But also the microbes cells themselves have to go through what we call cellular repair. So there has to be a kind of a rest period for both the human cells and also the microbial cells. So they have to go through their own cellular repair.
Is that so? Does that, like, they can't repair if they're busy digesting? Is that the sort of idea?
If you're to think of it that way. Yeah.
And I guess our bodies weren't designed to be constantly processing food, like, which is kind of, I think a lot of us, I'm guilty of this myself. You know, the constant sort of, even if it is healthy stuff you're eating, just constant eating mightn't be the best thing for your system either.
Yeah, now there is there are studies done on that, and but we don't, like, there's one big study called the TREAT study that was a clinical trial done on both obese women and obese men, and that was all around what we call time restricted eating. But it's one study. I think we need to do more studies around kind of time restricted eating and looking at the effect it actually has, particularly on what we call the non-eating state, where the body goes into kind of ketogenic state. Yeah. So there's still work to be done on that.
And what did the TREAT study suggest then? That intermittent fasting is a positive thing?
Yeah, so that it is good to actually do some intermittent fasting throughout the 24-hour period. And again, that's linked back to the cells having to do their cellular repair, and the microbe cells to do cellular repair also. Because whether it's a human cell or whether it's a bacterial cell or a fungal cell or whatever, they all have mitochondria, which is the powerhouse in the cell, and the mitochondria are important for producing ATP. So we're talking about energy metabolism there. So all cells, you know, if you think of any cell, whether it's a human cell or microbial cell, they have components in them, and so those components need to go through a rest and repair stage. Okay, so similar to if you were to, drive your car, you have to how would I say, you'd have to service your car every year because you want to make sure the engine's going to run smoothly all the time, or the brakes are going to work effectively. So you have to, the body itself, the human body and cells and the microbial cells, they also have to go through, their components have to be repaired and recycled. So there is So by consuming food all the time is not going to give those cells a chance to actually go through what we call a cellular repair.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can we finish maybe on just some practical tips for people then? And maybe before we get into that, like what does a typical day look like in your house? Because like I'm imagining with everything about gut health, that like you've got to be, is it a utopian vision of like prebiotic, probiotic consumption, lots of sauerkrauts, lots of is it all perfect, or do you like the odd, couple of bars of chocolate and a glass of red wine as well?
No, it's not all perfect, but certainly, I suppose, what do I do? I have 2 cups of boiled water in the morning is what I have, and then I'll...
Why is that good, do you think?
I guess, well, for me, I just have to be aware that I have to hydrate my body. That's one thing.
We didn't talk about water, actually. Presumably is a very important thing as well for the gut.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It is, because microbes require moisture in order to grow, along with their carbohydrates and nitrogen sources. Yeah.
Okay.
So for me, I guess breakfast is always, can be a combination of homemade granola, berries and yogurt. So full fat, normal, good old fashioned full fat yogurt. Some days it might be eggs and sourdough bread, and lunch and dinner is probably a combination of fish and fruit and veg. And I do eat meat. I eat red meat and white meat. Not every day.
Okay.
So for me, treats would be dark chocolate. I'm not a milk chocolate fan. I'm not a major biscuit fan, but I do like the odd cake and pastry.
Yeah, okay.
so that's kind of, so just
it's pretty close
simple.
to a Mediterranean diet by the sounds of it. Lots of fish and vegetables and...
Yeah, pretty close to Mediterranean. I do try to eat fruit and veg. Ideally, you're meant to have between 30 and 35 fruits and veg every week. So I try to challenge that and to
variety
that.
Presumably is important as well. Like, is that a fair point that the gut likes variety, or does it like consistency?
I think variety is good, and certainly in my case, what I always try to do is I genuinely try to eat within season. So whatever is in season is what I try to consume. So, yes.
Why do you think that's important?
Because I think the nutritional density of the food at that time is really rich. So for me, I don't think of food in terms of calories. I've never thought of food in that way. And I've certainly never thought of food in a way of, if I eat too much food, I'm going to put on weight, or if I eat too little, I'm going to not put on weight. I look at food in a very different way to some people. I look at it in a way that I'm feeding my microbes. I'm not necessarily feeding my body, so to speak. I always think of, why am I eating this food? I'm eating this food because I know I'm going to feed my microbes. And so I'm feeding them. I'm not feeding me. Wow. And that's the way I think of food.
It's a totally different way of thinking about eating. But presumably you can take pleasure in it at the same time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Oh, I love food. Yeah. I love the taste of food. I love the texture. I love the social aspect of it and all of those things. But I'll always think of it in a way of, how can I feed my microbes in the best way I possibly can. Yeah.
That's fascinating. I know from the work we do here that when it has an impact for someone, that's what keeps you gets you up in the morning, kind of thing. Like, have there been examples where you've thought, when you've seen an impact on one of your clients and thought, Jesus, this is having a huge impact?
Yeah, I have. I've had several clients, but one in particular I'm thinking of. In fact, she has come back to me now a year later, where she needed some help, having gone through. I suppose she'd been chronically ill, and I suppose she was at the end of the road as to what other options she should take. So when I was able to explain to her what her current microbiome profile looked like, and by helping her put in new dietary interventions, changing up her diet a little bit, that she realized then that she could actually, she felt better. She felt better, and that she was taking control of her own health as well. I think that's quite important for people. Like,
practically speaking, you don't need, obviously you're not going to share her name, and nor do we want to know, but like what were the symptoms, and what was the practical steps that changed that?
Oh, well, the symptoms were that, so she had, I suppose, she had gone through several rounds of chemotherapy, and so therefore her gut profile was limited, and she wanted to start by improving the diversity of her microbiome, because when we looked at it, it was, I suppose, a bit like taking antibiotics. Chemotherapy has an effect on the gut and the gut microbiome. So that's, I suppose, a chronic case. So when I suggested, consume this, and this, and this will improve the microbial diversity, that meant it actually, when I think about it now, it was actually she had hope. Yeah.
That's really
yeah, she did. Yeah,
incredible.
So I thought, so it gave her hope, and it gave her hope to actually take charge and to be responsible in whatever way to decide to consume and make effort on eating X, Y, and Z. It made a difference.
And when she comes back to you a year later, then are you retesting at that stage to see what changes, or is it more that her symptoms have changed?
Yeah, it depends on different clients will request different things.
Yeah.
Some people will come back after a year and they just want, it's a bit like going for your NCT, checking how are you doing. Some people will come back after a year and get checked again and see what their microbiome profile is a year later, and if it's the same or if it's better. I don't like using the word same or better, but just, we can kind of keep an eye on where it is. The microbiome changes anyway depending on your diet.
Yeah.
But we can see that if you change the diet and improve the diet, that the microbiome will actually respond within a short space of time. So you can actually improve it even over 6 to 12 weeks. You can actually have an improved overall gut performance or gut health in general. So yeah.
The last question I would ask maybe is just like, do you have, well, sorry, it's the second last question because I have one very important question for you at the end, but
it's okay.
What would be 2 or 3 tips, I suppose, like for generally speaking for our health as people listening to this, that we can do for our gut health? What would you recommend?
Okay. Fiber. Yeah, because we're not eating enough of it, I think is one of the key ones for me. Good old-fashioned yogurts, good old-fashioned cheese, root vegetables, fermented foods, a little bit of hard cheese. These would be the things that I would consume.
Do you think people that are following vegan diets then are going to be challenged to have really good gut health if they're not, or are there alternatives in the sort of vegan or plant-based world?
Yeah, there probably are alternatives. Yeah, and in fact I have looked at the microbiome profile of vegans and vegetarians, and the diversity is different. Their range is narrower than an individual who doesn't consume dairy. But that doesn't mean...
Sorry, the vegan microbiome is narrower than an omnivore's diet.
Than an omnivore's diet, yeah. It'll be narrower, but that doesn't mean it's good or bad. That's just the way it is based on what you're feeding the microbiome. And you can change it quite quickly. So by consuming different types of proteins, you're going to increase the proteolytic microbiome. So you don't have to consume, say, red meat to increase your proteolytic bacteria. You just consume fruit and veg that actually have a high percentage of protein in it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not that a vegan diet or vegetarian diet is how would I say, is not as good as a non-vegetarian or vegan diet. It's as a response of what you're feeding the microbes is what your microbiome profile is actually going to look like.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That is really clear. And the last one, we've a bit of a tradition. We like to finish by asking our guests, why does food matter to you, Rebecca?
I guess I genuinely love food. I think food for me is all those things we mentioned. It is social. It's important for us to eat food, to look after our microbes, because, as you say, food matters. My answer to that is, microbes matter too. So it's I always think of it, and you're feeding your microbes, and your microbes matter because they are what are keeping you in good health.
Or not.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Rebecca, this has been an absolutely fascinating, I feel like we've kind of gone down a rabbit hole in in some respects, and a whole kind of universe has opened up. So thank you so much for taking us through that, and continued success.
Yeah, thank you very much, and it was a pleasure to have the conversation. Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Food Matters, but we would love you to get more connected to the GIY universe. So we believe that our food system is having a catastrophic impact on people's health and the health of our planet, and we think a movement of people growing some of their own food is the way to fix it. You can stay connected to GIY by signing up to our free newsletter and check out our full range of events, campaigns, resources and courses at giy.ie. Check out the show notes for more information. Thanks for listening, and see you soon.